Well, somewhere around one's teenage years and into the 20s, perhaps earlier, but you realise you're learning how to live. You know those self-help books? Now, it's a bit like reading those. You realise on all fronts there's a need for wisdom and understanding. And you may keep it secular like that, or you may have been launched on a religious view because of family background, people you know. And so you may be coming to understand your religion, and that in large measure is also purposed on how to live. And you start to find you're trying to perfect all fields. In my case, I suppose I was aware that how to study, how to relate to people at school, difficult teachers, difficult kids, and good friendly kids. You may have learned right back in sort of primary school the importance of friends, a close friend, loyalty, of protecting each other, of coming to each other's defence, and meeting often so that you support each other. You may start to realise your relationship with your family too, how you get on best with mum, dad, brothers, sisters, how you keep out the way of certain people because they seem a cost and a trouble and even a fear to you. You start to master how to live in the world that you're in. Now, I didn't stumble upon the help that religion would give. My family was not religious. My school wasn't really religious. I mean, they had morning assemblies, but that was because it's a state school, and in those days, some slight measure of religion was compulsory. You would have one period a week of 40 minutes, say 35 minutes, of religious instruction, which was not, for instance, particularly by a person who was that religious. So it would be more about religion than what religion is really purposed to do, which is, of course, to give you fullness of life. Well, unless it's totally dominated by and taught by the state, in which case it's to fit you into society, which I suppose cynically is to make you productive, useful and safe from the state's point of view. I suppose we could say philosophically that's the corruption of religion. The purity of religion would be to rescue you into fullness of life, competence and, life eternal, I suppose. Somewhere in one's education you start to realise that just as the school is trying to train you on many fronts, many subjects, you are wanting to train yourself on perhaps more important subjects, namely how to live and relate to people around you, be happy, get the best out of life, avoid catastrophes, fights, certain individuals that are not good for you, how to be much with those that are good. And then you start to realise there are different domains and environments, from your den in the garden to enjoying going along the canals and lakes, go fishing, and probably with a friend, and how best to prepare for such outings, day trips. We used to wander off into the fields or into the woods, exploring, take a drink of orangeade and some sort of snacks, sandwiches. You start to prepare adventures, experiences that you're largely autonomous, controlling yourself in. You know, the den is that, isn't it? I can make myself a shelter, a house, a den. I can breed goldfish, and there's other forms of life, water snails, water newts, you know, water lizards, newts, plants even. You start to know how you can even manage mum and dad, how to relate best to them. You may realise mum and dad are lethal together, whereas separately you can relate to them very well. When they're together, you're really none of the picture, you're an appendage. You know, they're going for a drive in the country, you go with them, of course, but you're in the back of the car, alone if you're an only child. And they go into a pub, but kids couldn't go into pubs, so they bring you out a packet of crisps and a drink, and you wait an hour or two. And learn patience in being with mum, devoted to mum. I learned early on the importance of being devoted to mum, and I learned incredible patience. They thought I was a saintly child in many ways. I mean, Dad was not impressed because I started to get the impression, probably from Mum, that he wasn't interested in kids, really. But even so, he was interested in duty, and he too had his view of a right relationship to you. Mum, on the other hand, I was devoted to. And life was, to support Mum was everything. I matured in a relationship with her as an adult, friend to friend, because of her needs and her difficulties, especially with Dad. And found I could rescue her in our relationship together, that I could make her life feel worthwhile and happy. And she was much appreciative of me, loved me quite simply, and me her. So I learned to understand the view of an adult, possibly rather narcissistic adult, in fairness. She was extremely good looking and knew it, had pictures of herself in every room. I mean, that's a bit narcissistic, isn't it? I mean, I just thought it was normal, and after all, she was very good looking and beautiful. I mean, you know, there weren't pictures of Dad in each room. And there was one or two pictures of me around. I can't really remember where, mind you. Yes. So I was taught to see the world from Mum's point of view. Neither of them were very religious. Well, Dad was anti. Mum was neutral to anti. In other words, religion had been a great disappointment to her. As went to Sunday school, been there, done that, didn't do me much good, sort of thing, you know. Dad never been near a Sunday school, I don't think, but was impressed with culture. So he would go into a church because it was an interesting place to go to, and this is part of our history and society, and it wasn't, I mean, religion was in large measure a load of rubbish, except it housed our traditions and part of our greatness in some way in the past, you know. So one would certainly visit a cathedral, but one would visit it as a museum and an architectural wonder, not a spiritual habitation. You know, if anything, he would have respected High Church, but not for its religious content, but for the fact that it housed part of our British culture and so on, you know. A bit like he respected the City and the Bank of England and the Stock Exchange and government and royalty and the Queen. You know, one stood for the Queen when you went to the cinema at the end of the film. You would stand up, national anthem might play, or it might even be done in, I think it was always at the end. And I don't know what age where they started to stop doing that, playing the national anthem. We think of indoctrination now with our media and computing and so on, but we were heavily traditionally into indoctrination. It's how you controlled the people and united the country, and patriotism was very much upheld by the state as part of your duty and responsibility and who you were. You knew your place in society in that sense. Respect and integrity, honesty and correct behavior was constantly being reinforced by the culture and especially by the school. And in my house, particularly Dad. Mum was more a rebel, of course. Rules are there to be broken. Down to the depths or up to the throne. He travels fastest who travels alone. Would have been Mum's philosophy. Whereas Dad's was more Queen and country and integrity and your place in society, respect and honour. It was a world where you learnt the formal, especially things like manners. You were taught good manners, how to behave socially and in public. You know, even, or especially top society, knew what you could talk about and what you could not talk about. You know, it was a Victorian type of Edwardian rule that you knew you were not to discuss things like politics, economics, or religion, because these were contentious fields, and you weren't to have ideas really that collided with your responsibility as a citizen, an upright person of respect, and tremendous class structure, of course, in England, Europe, not as entrenched as the Indian caste system, but in its way, very dominant as regards your behaviour. You needed to know your role and place in life, whether you were rich or poor or business or elite class, whatever it was. People in shops were expected to be extremely civil, polite. They knew how to relate in a far more, what we would think today was a non-relating way. One feels insulted and distanced by formality in the modern world. You expect people to be relating and that wasn't so in my parents' culture. The external world was a formality, and there was an expectation that you would keep formality. It was despised to be friendly where this was not yet achieved. You didn't assume casual friendliness. You assumed a formal way of relating. You shook hands, you said good morning and how are you, and you kept off, as I say, certain contentious issues, politics, economics, religion. You only went to people when you were invited, and you invited them back an equal number of times, and there were sort of subtle ways of breaking off a relationship where you didn't respond by inviting them back to you for a longer period of time, and they'd gradually get the message and they'd respond likewise, and you'd disengage from social activity in this very civilized way. There were ways of inviting people and ways of responding. The RSVP, responde s'il vous plaît, reply, if you please, was an absolute obligation. You booked, you agreed to come, and you kept your word. The more classy you were, the more you kept your integrity and kept to the social code. There was a thing against nonconformity, just as there was in religion, that you could be Christian if you were conformist state church, Anglican. You could be nonconformist, but only nonconformist in a very conformist way. You saw yourself as a Methodist or whatever it was, Baptist, or you weren't way out like Mormon or Jehovah's Witness. They just didn't exist. They may have been beginning to, because those sort of things like theosophy and that took off in the 1900s, but they weren't dominant in the culture of society. They were strange exceptions that were trying to find their place in the order of things and were not really accepted, There was horror against certain moral breaches like divorce. Having an affair was scandalous. People would stop talking to you, or you'd get fired from your job because, you'd got getting divorced or something. That was just terrible. You couldn't expect acceptance in society if you were openly having affairs. Many people did have affairs, especially the rich and the kings and royalty, but it was all hushed up and tolerated behind, closed doors and curtains and so on, so to speak. It was a strange world. And you forget, you probably don't know even, that sort of reality of living. the world has changed, and we find we have much criticism perhaps of the way society and politics and economics and the media and technology is going, and wars, and there was always wars, of course. I mean, empire was a very respected and a valued thing in a society that had an empire. It wasn't seen as abominable, whereas now it is. You know, it's seen as an imposition on other nations and peoples, and crushing differences of standard and quality of life of different classes of people. Terrible. It wasn't seen as terrible. It was seen as my grandmother would say to my mum, the poor don't feel like we do, darling. Well, dear, she wouldn't say darling, but you know, she'd say it in this very matriarchal way. And there's no arguing with such people. You simply accept this is something you must accept because they're saying it. And of course my mum, coming from a poorer class, was a rebel, but a rebel within, because you had to conform to and survive in this culture. So because of my strong relationship with Mum, I was initiated from the beginning into an astonishing non-conformity. And I used it, of course, to do well as she had. She'd started very poor but very beautiful. Married someone who was very well off indeed. And, you know, he was a big fish in a little pool, so to speak, his local small town, what you might call a small city in New Zealand. And he liked to be a big fish in a little pool, not a medium fish in a big pool. In other words, in some sense, he knew his best option as he saw it. But started off with an incredible privilege as regards money, wealth, ownership of property, which had been in the family for a generation or two. His granddad had been a builder and amassed a lot of property in Victorian times. So in a sense, I'd seen how two adults lived in their worlds and had come together with a great mismatch. And there was great turbulence in the household. Not good, you would say. But I suppose the two differences made contrast, a bit like, you know, the universe being of good and bad, and therefore you learn the value of the good and to avoid the bad. You mature. So I could say in hindsight, unquestionably, I was blessed by this, what one would see as a very imperfect situation, but possibly ideal training ground for what I've become. Now you might think what I've become is very strange and weird when you listen to these YouTube talks. I do it, of course, because I hope with all my heart that it be a blessing to you. And I'm seeking out what I understand to have been a blessing to myself and want to share it with you, of course. Why is this drive in me? I think because of an appreciation of Mum's love and care. I mean, she may have been a narcissist, actually, just as Dad was, may have been a pompous Victorian, almost anachronism increasingly in the world that was developing in like the 50s and 60s around him. He died he died at something like 62 and he was born 1909. So, yeah, I mean, not sure, is he sure the 70s, did he work it out? But, Mum lived on to 85 and was 10 years younger than him. She was born in 1919. They both, in a sense, became acceptable oddities in their world. But anything but entirely happy. And quite early on I started to realize, look, I'm seeking happiness. I think I must have somehow got that right. What is it that brings happiness and what doesn't? And by the grace of God, and possibly the integrity of both Mum and Dad, the love of Mum anyway, and the integrity of Dad, I was saved being tempted into, for instance, there was a growing culture of drugs in a seaside town like Southend-on-Sea, Essex, where I had much of my youth. And not in my tiny town, of course, I'd never heard of such things. But as I grew up, went to tech college, I realized people were taking, I think we got into these 60s LSD and all that sort of white powder stuff, but not Marshall. In Mum and Dad's culture, the problem had been alcohol, but Marshall never went down that road. I went down the road of eating meat, of course, that was normal in my culture. Mum never embraced vegetarianism, which was amazing to me because I felt she was kind, but apparently not that kind. Dad, of course, would have said absolute nonsense, was just a way of making yourself sick and ill. And even today I find vegetarianism is frowned upon by the less sensitive, if you like, in that regard. I tried smoking for a month or two, and by the grace of God then avoided it. Because of Mum's philosophy, I got close to flirting too much and being immoral. But I guess even the moral fibre of Mum, and certainly Dad, was faithful. Not necessarily loving, but, well, not at all. Well, not fair to say not at all, but he was kind in some ways. Especially materially, he could be kind, but not wasteful. Definitely held some people in contempt. But Mum did too, in a way, except not necessarily the poor. The rich that she'd hold in contempt for their selfishness and indulgence, and not realizing the plight of the poor, because she'd come from poor class, parents being living in a council house and service jobs and so on, and very much the inferior classes of society. Her dad closer to the upper classes of society, middle class, and as I say, wealthy and acceptable for that reason, really. but also for his integrity and Queen and country patriotism and so on. But to my stark goodness, I've been 30 minutes on this. Sorry to take so long. Just to get back to the beginning, learning how to live, to consciously realize I want to know how to do something. I came across an early series of books which we talked about in philosophy last night. We were meant to take a book that had been highly significant. I took Paramahansa's autobiography, of course. But amazingly, this philosophical and largely, 90% secular group, well, there was only 6 of us there. It's a very small response to this evening's meeting. And but 5 out of the 6, they were spiritual books. 2 of them were about Zen, and the others were philosophy. Only one exception, the mathematician. The book he took was Introduction to Calculus, that had been highly significant in his life. Symptomatic of the absolute poverty in the man's life, of the philosophical, the thoughtful, and the epitome of the mechanical, the thing that had blessed him, the occupation. An astonishing chap. Mari, I think he had 6 sisters and himself, and he was the eldest in the family. And from the start, despite the very non-academic nature of his culture and family, he was good at maths at school, outstandingly good. From the beginning, it seems. And of course, something like, in the 4th form, he was studying calculus because he got hold of this book on Introduction to Calculus. I didn't get to calculus till university, partly because I didn't do maths in the last 2 years at school. Not as a specialist subject. There was probably some background maths I was always doing. You always had something of maths and English. Or at Tech College I was doing statistics and English. English I was terrible at because of spelling in particular, and I was a very slow reader. Maths I was good at because I had practiced and applied my ability to learn. I learnt the formulas you were meant to know and did thousands of examples of mathematical problems that train you in being good at such, and was of course the foundation of logical thinking. So I wanted to know how to think. And as I was thinking also of a book that was outstanding very early on, which was Straight and Crooked Thinking by Robert H. Thales. Straight and Crooked Thinking taught you the very basics of logical analysis and thinking, not in a formal way, in a way that a youth could understand, the ordinary man in the street. And that was invaluable to me, and was why I was drawn to philosophy, why I was drawn to Humanist Society. I became a member even as a teenager. And, you tended not to have young people in that sort of thing. Like philosophy and things tend to be of older people. And drawn to study formal logic university under a chap called Alistair McIntyre, well-known philosopher, dead now, of course. I expect all my teachers are dead now. I'm 77, I expect them to be dead. Yeah. And some of my teachers, like Paramahansa, he died in 1952, so I would have only been 5 and certainly knew nothing of him at all. And I don't own to teachers now, but I do own to the fact how important they've been in the past, of course. Role models for me and so on. But nothing like the dominance and role model of mum. That was major. And if you have that relationship with an adult early on, you're going to be old before your time. I say old, I mean hopefully mature. And we never know. We only think from our point of view that we're right and on the right track. And if we get to the point where we think we're not on the right track, we search around very earnestly for what might be, don't we? Bless you. Thank you, Heavenly Dad.